So thank you for having me. It's really quite an honor to be presenting alongside my fellow speakers these past few days. I find your work really inspiring as someone who went down the liberal arts and the fine arts route and always had a lingering regret that maybe I should have studied science and technology and engineering. I really feel honored that I could maybe contribute in my small way to the work that you're doing to decentralize systems. So my talk is going to be about regulation of cryptocurrencies. And just to lay it out a little bit, I want to start by giving a brief lay of the land and introduction to how I'm going to set my terms and talk about this very broad subject, divided into some more digestible pieces. And then of those three pieces, I'm going to talk about financial surveillance or anti-money laundering, know your customer law first. I'm going to talk about consumer protection second. That will be in my second talk. Some of the financial surveillance material might end up in the second talk as well, depending on how quickly we go. And the third talk, which I'll give tomorrow, is going to be about securities regulation or investor protection, especially as it relates to token sales, initial coin offerings, whatever we're calling them these days, especially now that they're raising so much money. They're certainly a topic of interest. Feel free to make this conversational, so if anything I say is confusing to you or sparks an interesting thought, I'm happy to have a dialogue. But to start with an introduction, the basic question, are cryptocurrencies regulated? We could, of course, ask the newspapers, who never print anything that isn't true. So what do we have? We have Mozart. Well, that was actually quite nice. It might make this whole thing more palatable, because if it's going to be a talk about law and state violence, well, anyway. So the press. The so far unregulated digital currency has courted controversy. This is the BBC, blah, blah, blah. The value in the decentralized unregulated digital currency has plummeted, et cetera, et cetera. This one's my favorite from Time. A Texas man was charged with fraud in New York on Thursday in what federal authorities claim is the first ever Ponzi scheme involving unregulated digital currency, Bitcoin. This one's quite interesting because it's rather interesting that somebody would be charged with a crime when it's unregulated. But the hypocrisy makes some sense because I think the intuition here is that cryptocurrencies per se, as technological systems, are in some ways unregulated. I think even that's inaccurate. We might say that something like the money supply in Bitcoin, it's self-regulating. It uses economic incentives in cryptography to self-regulate. So maybe they're talking about it's not fiat currency, it's not regulated by the Fed or something like that. But we do know, of course, that activities that are performed using cryptocurrencies, if they were previously regulated when they're performed using older technologies, their traditional analogs, those regulated activities will still be regulated if you do the same activity just using a cryptocurrency. So if you commit fraud and you do it in the mail, it's not any different if you do it in the email. It's still fraud. If you commit money laundering, if you do it using dollars rather than bitcoins, it's money laundering either way. And this is because laws and regulations do not usually, and I think shouldn't, but they also do not usually target technologies or monolithic systems. They are activities-based, so they target particular problems. And as I hinted at, these are the three big problem areas that I want to focus on with my three talks here at Technion, because in our work at Coin Center, whereas Ellie said we primarily are a resource to, say, people in Congress or regulators, these are the reoccurring themes that come up. There's questions of financial surveillance, and this is a term that I like to use because I like to call things what I think they are. There's a bit of a more euphemistic term, which is that these regulations are about anti-money laundering or know your customer or counterterrorism financing. But really what we can describe them all as is financial surveillance. And then we can have a discussion about the need for financial surveillance or whether it violates privacy. But what we're talking about is deputizing intermediaries, whether they be banks or companies like PayPal or companies like Zappo or Coinbase, to collect information about US citizens or about citizens across the world and share it with government, usually without any kind of warrant or normal judicial check in place. So it really is a surveillance structure. Not all that different than the surveillance conversation we've had more aggressively about, say, things like emails stored on Google's servers and whether we have a privacy right to those things. And yet we don't really talk about it as much in the financial privacy context. For some reason, even though the first area to really find mass data collection and a mandate for private companies to report customer data to the government was the banking area, we didn't have as much of a conversation about that as we had with the rise of mass surveillance on the internet for things like email and chat logs and things like that. But they're really analogous problems. The next is consumer protection. And I'm going to speak actually fairly narrowly about consumer protection because the area that is most relevant to cryptocurrencies is not things like unfair and deceptive business practices where the company made warranted something and then the product didn't work as it was intended. The bigger issue with consumer protection is what we call sometimes prudential regulation or sometimes called business licensing regulation. And these are regulations where there is a company that holds value for people. And it could be a bank, so it could be in a depository context where they take deposits and they make loans, in which case you want to regulate them prudentially to make sure they don't over-leverage, make too many loans on too few deposits. Or it could be a more simple custodian who doesn't engage in fractional reserve lending or hypothecation of the assets they hold, but rather is supposed to hold them in custody, in trust for the customer, just one-to-one. In those cases, we call those businesses money services businesses or money transmitters or payments companies or e-money businesses in the EU. And they don't go through a chartering process like a bank would. They go through a licensing process instead. And that can usually happen at the state level in the United States. So you have to get a license in every state where you have customers. Or it would happen at the nation level in the European Union. Although they're quite enlightened in the EU, if you get an e-money license, you can passport it from any state to any other state by doing some fairly rote secondary steps. Anyway, the final category, which I'll talk about not today, tomorrow, is investor protection, another problem area. And this is most commonly understood as securities regulation. There's other investor protection regulations like commodities, futures, and swaps and things like that. But the big issue with cryptocurrency, especially now that people are raising upwards of $200 million in token sales, is this question. Is a token, when it's pre-mined by a group of developers or a private company and sold before the network's even live or launched, is that act the creation of an investment contract, the kind of thing that you'd regulate? Is it akin to an IPO? ICO is a terrible choice of terms if you're trying to make the argument that it's different. But apparently it's stuck, and there's nothing I can do about it despite trying my best over the last 2 years to get that term to go on, but it's sticking. So, and these laws and regulations, they target particular parties always. So again, we're not targeting the technology as a whole, we're targeting parties who can make a difference in the particular problem. So for financial surveillance purposes, who would you target? Who can make a difference in that problem? Well, you'd find somebody who has a bird's eye view of the financial system. And that'd be something like Bank of America. Or in the modern context, it might be PayPal. A company that has high visibility into the flows of funds and can notice when there's either the illicit proceeds of crime moving through their institution that they can report on, or perhaps something even worse, something like terrorism financing. So a certain category of businesses are defined as financial institutions in these regulations, whether in the US or in the EU or in Israel. And then anybody who fits this definition has to do certain financial service surveillance compliance obligations. Similarly, if your problem is consumer protection, who do you target in your regulations? You're going to target the people who actually hold money, hold value as a custodian for other people. And finally, in the case of investor protection, who do you target? You're going to target issuers and promoters of securities, so the people who actually have a common enterprise, divvy it up into little chunks, securitize it, and sell it off to the general public, or maybe just to accredited investors or whoever. These are the issuers and the promoters of securities. In the case of tokens, it would be the people potentially who created the initial distribution of tokens on some sort of altcoin genesis block and decided to have a pre-sale to raise money. Now, there's other targets for securities regulation which are not listed here, which are probably worth discussing, and I'll spend some time on them tomorrow, and those are the secondary markets. So once you issue a new cryptocurrency, if it is a security for some reason, what happens when it pops up on Kraken or Poloniex or a secondary exchange or Shapeshift? Because technically, if it's a security, and it's still a security at that point, which is an open question, then it can't simply be traded on any platform. It needs to be a registered securities exchange regulated by the SEC, self-regulated sometimes by FINRA or by other organizations. And what that means is it's going to be the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ, which is a radically different level of compliance obligations than what we see most of the secondary exchanges engaging in to this day, the cryptocurrency exchanges, which have presumed that they're not securities exchanges. So again, third-party financial institutions, what are they targeted to do? What are they supposed to do? They're supposed to collect information about their users, report suspicious transactions to law enforcement, a few other things. Custodial money transmitters, they will generally need to be licensed before they begin operations, and they need to take steps to guarantee their solvency. They don't lose consumer funds. And sellers of investment contracts, issuers of securities, these are synonyms. Investment contract is sort of the broadest term within the US securities laws for things that are securities. Anything that is an investment contract is a security. Well, these people must register their offerings with the securities authorities and commit to making certain disclosures to investors about common sense things like their profits, their losses, their revenue, things like that. And amongst a variety of cryptocurrency actors, now that we understand the underlying areas of regulation, amongst a variety of cryptocurrency actors, whether they be miners or someone running a full node, or in upcoming consensus protocols, someone making a proof of stake, or whether they be a software developer, and within that category we can break it down further, core protocol developers, client, user front-end developers for, say, wallets, Android wallets, iOS wallets, things like that. Maybe even people who are writing code for smart contracts, say, that are going to run on the Ethereum virtual machine, a whole category. Whether you're a software developer or you're running an exchange. And these would include the custodial exchanges that both hold tokens for people and help them buy and sell them and access markets. Or it could also include exchanges that were really just places that connect buyers and sellers and aren't custodial, either because they're something like local bitcoins or because they are maybe using newer technologies like cross-chain atomic trades to do custodian-free exchanges, or they use ERC-20 compatible tokens, so you could, in theory, build an exchange without having a trusted party taking custody. Or maybe, aside from exchanges, you're the kind of person who wants to, get people to buy a new token. You're a promoter. If you're a promoter, if you're any of these people, the question is, do you fit into any of these established definitions? Financial institution, or a money transmitter, or a securities promoter? Because if you do, even though you are using very exotic technology to do these activities, you're still regulated. It doesn't matter that you're using new technology. You're still doing the regulated activity. You are regulated. So this is the inquiry we see over and over again in the space. Even as new things like ICOs emerge, it's the same old laws that we need to query. But then there's a second inquiry. And the second inquiry, it doesn't need to come in serial like this, but it makes sense. There's another question. If we were to regulate these activities, as we regulated their traditional analogs, would we be potentially running up against compelling constitutional or rights-based or public policy arguments that would suggest that we should not regulate them the same way, or maybe even cannot regulate them the same way? And when I say cannot, I mean two things. I mean, one, maybe it's physically impossible. So an example of that is in an early draft of the BIT license, the money transmission-like licensing framework that was created in New York by the Department of Financial Services to license Bitcoin exchanges. In an early draft, it said, you, the licensed exchange, need to keep records. You need to keep records that also include the personal identifiable information, name, address, of the recipient of every transaction that your customer initiates. But of course, we know how Bitcoin works. If I have a phone that has a wallet on it, even if it's a custodial wallet like Coinbase or Zappo or something like that, and I want to pay someone, I'm going to take a picture of a QR code. And there's no name and address attached to that QR code. It is effectively a public key. And it's a way of moving money on the blockchain to someone else's control, to the control of some other signature. There's no other information on the blockchain. There isn't even IP addresses or things like this. I'm just paying. So it would be impossible, quite literally, for any exchange or custodial wallet provider to comply with that provision of the bit license. Now, then you are left with a choice if you're a regulator. Okay, if what you meant to do was make this impossible, you should just ban it. Or if what you really wanted to do was regulate these companies, then you need to actually find a way to modify your expectations as far as what can be enforced. It can't be enforced the way you wanted it to be enforced. And they stripped that provision out. I like to think in part because organizations like Coin Center commented and said this is not rational if what you're trying to achieve is regulation. But it could also be you cannot apply this regulatory structure to the activity in the new technology, not because it's impossible technologically, but maybe because it actually now violates some sort of constitutional norm. And so in the US, the Constitution is very tangibly a limit on what legislation can do and what the executive branch can enforce when it comes to legislation. So there's certain things that are impermissible if they violate fundamental rights. And in the international context, it's not quite as direct, but we have similar structures, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the German Basic Law, things like this. So if, when you apply the existing regulations to the technology, you suddenly find that you're impinging upon a fundamental human right, maybe this would actually not be something we can continue to do, even though this problem didn't rise in the traditional financial services regulation field or something along those lines. And so what do I mean? Well, I'm American, so you have to indulge me. I'm going to focus on our constitutional arguments, but as I said, there's similar analogs. There's things like free speech. The Congress and the executive branch cannot make and enforce laws that impermissibly limit people's ability to speak. We do regulate speech, but there's a higher burden. You need to prove a very compelling government interest, and you need to prove that the law that limits the speech, that stops people from saying something, is narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. It's not just a blanket restriction. Nobody can publish this software. Nobody can publish this research. It's too broad. And of course, there's the Fourth Amendment in the US, which is kind of like a privacy right against the government, not against corporations. It says that we have a right to not be the target of an unwarranted search or seizure. So the government can't show up at your door, open it, and go and rifle through your private papers. That would be unconstitutional. They have to first get a warrant from a judge, because the judge is supposed to be a judicial check on their exercise of power. Hopefully the fox isn't guarding the henhouse, if you will, when it comes to your privacy rights. And of course, there's the Fifth Amendment, which Dave Chappelle, unfortunately, or fortunately, provides the only entertaining Google image search results. The Fifth Amendment is, I plead the Fifth. It's, I'm not going to self-incriminate, so I'm going to remain silent. And there's other constitutional rights that may become relevant, but these are the big ones. So in any of these situations, we ask this question, would regulating any of these cryptocurrency activities that we've discussed jeopardize our constitutional rights or otherwise be against public policy? And I put against public policy in scare quotes because if you've been to at least an American law school, and it might be similar in Israel, and you run out of constitutional arguments to make, but you think the law is a bad idea, you say, and now I will describe why this law is against public policy, and proceed to make a bunch of probably bullshit economic or social choice or other rights-based arguments that don't have a grounding in something nice like a paper document, but actually some of them are quite valid. So an overview of my remaining talks. For the rest of this talk and probably the beginning of the next talk I'm going to give later after lunch, I'm going to focus on this category, financial surveillance or anti-money laundering regulation. Later in my second talk today, I'll talk about consumer protection, and tomorrow I'm going to talk about investor protection, securities regulation. So I'll stop here.